Hello and welcome to another episode of the Simple Faith Podcast. My name is Dave Betts, and together with my wife Sharia, we are exploring all the things that make our faith what it is. We're stripping away all of those unnecessarily churchy and intellectual words and exploring what it looks like to pursue authentic Christianity for normal people. We've been working through a series that we've called Tough Conversations, and in the last two episodes, we've talked about suffering. Why would God allow suffering? And this week, we're going to be talking about depression. And next week, we're going to talk about grief. So we're not straying away from some of those difficult conversations. Talking about some challenges, Sharia was supposed to be on today's episode with me as well. That was the plan, that we would record 3 of those in one day, and our son JJ would be looked after by his grandma. Unfortunately, that proved to be a little bit challenging. That's the bad news. So Sharia couldn't join us because she's looking after our 4-month-old. The good news is that now our very good friend Eliz Argent is with us. So Eliz, thank you so much for joining us. We're so glad. You're actually a really obvious choice to talk about this. So maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Eliz, as you said. I'm married to Simon, who's obviously been on the podcast twice, I think, already. And I studied at Royal Holloway. I did a degree in psychology, and then I moved on to work for a local charity called East to West. And as a charity, we work across the area where I live, working with young people in lots of different situations, in schools. And I also run a project in the local hospital where we work with young people in mental health crisis. As they're kind of coming in that crisis, we meet them. And then we also follow up with them in the community, helping them work through how to move forward, working through different things that are going on in their life, and trying to give them strategies for coping and helping them engage in other services as well. So yeah, a very, very varied role.
It's a great role. Eliz not only works a lot with young people in her job, but you're heavily involved with pastoring and mentoring students as well at church, at Ascot Life Church, where you go to church. You're also a very gifted worship leader, so we're going to have you on this podcast talking about worship at some point. And also, you're my songwriting buddy. We write songs together for the church and stuff like that. So, Eliz, maybe I can share a quick story about you, because Simon and Liz are very, very good friends of ours. And so it's good to have them on the podcast. We actually went to IKEA with them one day. We had we had nothing else better to do. So we spent a day just walking around IKEA. Yeah, we were in the checkout line, and Eliz looks up at some water, and she's like, I'm really thirsty. I really need something to quench my thirst. And we were like, Eliz, what did you just say? Yeah, I need to quench my thirst. But no, Eliz, I'm pretty sure it's quench, but and she was like, really? I had no idea. So Eliz, how do you explain that? I mean, some people might be listening and thinking that's not really that funny, or maybe that's just discredited you as a prominent voice on any kind of topic.
No longer have authority. There's not much of an explanation, to be honest. I just always thought it was clench, which is kind of hilarious. And so that day changed my life. So you've changed my life. IKEA often has the ability to change your life in some way. Usually it's the meatballs or the cheap desks, but for you it's the work, it's the words. The water and the words. Great. Well, today we are talking about depression, and it's great to kind of laugh and joke around a little bit before we get going. But the reality is that depression is a big deal. There's such a prevalence of depression in our world at the moment in a way that wasn't the case when I was a kid. That's not to say that people weren't depressed, but there is a prevalence. We've talked in previous shows about the reality of technology and smartphones and all those things and the impact it has on mental health. But what we want to do today is really drill down into depression, particularly how do we respond to depression as Christians? Because there's this implicit feeling that I think people have sometimes that, well, if I'm depressed, I'm doing something wrong as a Christian, because I'm supposed to have joy. I'm supposed to be joyful always. Jesus is Savior, so I'm supposed to just be happy all the time. Like the charismatic church is often called happy, clappy Christians. What if you're just clappy? That's a problem, isn't it? So, I think that's the challenge. So
what I want us to do today, Eliz, is maybe talk about the realities of depression. What is it, and maybe where we can find it in the Bible. And then I want us to talk about the causes. I think maybe you have some insight into that, and there's some helpful books that I found maybe that can give us some insight into that.
Yeah.
And then the two really big questions are: how do we respond as Christians when we are depressed, and also how do we respond to the people around us when they are depressed? How do we make sure that we get those things right? So maybe that's a bit of a roadmap for where we're going to go today. Maybe let's start with some definitions. So, like, at its core, what is depression, and how is depression different maybe to sadness?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think it's sometimes I find it quite difficult sometimes to kind of define depression. I think from my experience of those I've worked with, I think one of the main things that kind of comes out is this interruption to your everyday being and life, and not being able to carry on with just the things that a lot of us would just see as normal. So kind of making yourself have a meal to eat, or making sure you have a shower, or kind of getting up in the morning. It's this sense of a disruption to your routine, maybe a loss of interest in things that actually before you would really enjoy. And I think that's where it can happen to anyone, can't it? You know, we think, I'll never be that person to, you know, just be in bed, as some people might say. But actually it's deeper than that. It's so much deeper than sadness. It's this sense of not being able to function in life, I think.
Yeah, that's really good. I have a bit of a confession to make, I think, when it comes to depression. I'm pretty sure when I was 14, 15, 16, again, I've mentioned this on the podcast, but I was really struggling myself with depression. And thankfully, in my situation, I just had this moment where it was like a switch went off and I was fine. And so I used to have this cold view of depression, which was like, well, I was fine, so you should just be fine too.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was a bit older and started to see it a bit more where you realize it's a bit more complicated. Yeah, for some people, it's like a switch that just turns off and you're fine. But actually, for some people, it's a challenge. I think it's John Piper who wrote. I've got it written down further in my notes. Who wrote a book called "When the Darkness Will Not Lift." And that's a really great way of putting it, I think. Actually, like that's what it feels like. Sometimes that darkness just doesn't lift, and you know, maybe you just might be like, I'm fine now. And in other situations, it might feel like you just can't shake this feeling of deep, deep sadness, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, with that, it also comes down to what is going on in your life. Like, I think we'll come on to it, but kind of the causes of depression and what that might look like. That's different for everyone as well. So that will also change whether you know, it's a click off or actually something that takes a lot longer to work through. Yeah.
So I think maybe, you know, that's a little bit, that's what depression is. It's more than just sadness. It's like this deep, I like the way you said it. It was like it's this interruption. It's when you can hardly, you know, sometimes you find it hard to even function. I wonder, do I have anything in my notes here? There's a list here. It says, you know, here are some depression symptoms that I think you mostly talked about, but it's like feeling sad or having a depressed mood, which, I mean, that one seems like an obvious one. If you're depressed, of course, you have a depressed mood. Loss of interest or pleasure in activities once enjoyed, changes in appetite, weight loss or gain unrelated to dieting, trouble sleeping or sleeping too much. I think you mentioned that. Loss of energy or increased fatigue, increased in purposeless physical activity. So the inability to sit still, pacing, hand wringing, or slow movements or speech, or these actions, it says here, must be observable by others. And so, you know, it's happening enough that people can see it. Feeling worthless or guilty, difficult thinking, concentrating or making decisions, or thoughts of death or suicide. So this is from the American Psychiatric Association. Yeah. So that if you're feeling any of those things, know that we are so for you and we're with you. We're not. What we want to talk about today is how do we respond to that? We're not here to tell you whether you are depressed or not. But what we want to do is, maybe if you're feeling that and you're listening, help you diagnose it, but primarily talk about how we respond. So I think something that I'm really keen that we talk about, Eliz, is the fact that depression is not incompatible with faith. You know, we see depression all throughout the Bible, don't we?
I think, you know, just to name a few, we see it in Job, who's it's this sense of lamenting, I think, and in Lamentations and Ecclesiastes and just to name a few, and just like certain people throughout the Bible, there's some things that they say that you think, oh, I could relate to that. Like when I'm feeling that way, this sense of carrying big burdens or things happening where you come to the end of yourself. And like with Job, he lost everything, didn't he? And I'm not saying you have to lose everything to be depressed, but in his situation, I can imagine that he felt pretty depressed because you would. It's a normal thing. And I think the Bible really actually normalizes these feelings of deep sadness and loss.
Yeah, you mentioned the word lament, and I think that's a really key word. I think we'll come back to that in a little bit because there's a book I found really helpful that I want to share a little bit later. But I mean, just a few more examples. Like there's someone called Hannah in the Bible who is depressed because she's not able to have kids, and she wants to have a baby desperately, and she's just desperately sad that she can't. Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet because he's just so filled with sadness. And there's an entire book called Lamentations. I think I always get mixed up with Lamentations and Ecclesiastes, but I think it's Ecclesiastes that says meaningless, everything is meaningless. Then you've got the book of Psalms, which is all just like filled. There was someone that said, I think they said that 70% of the Psalms were Psalms of lament, which is Psalms of sadness, essentially. Now, I can't tell you whether that's true or not. I just read it, and sometimes you read stuff online and you're like, I don't know if that's true. But that, I mean, even for someone to even say that indicates that these Psalms are hugely prevalent in the book of Psalms as a whole. In a book called Christians Get Depressed Too by David Murray, he says that maybe even Timothy suffered from near paralyzing anxiety as well. In Numbers, Moses says, I can't carry these people by myself. They are too much for me, which indicates that potentially he's experiencing feelings of depression, with the weight of leadership that comes as well. Yeah. So, and there's a bunch of examples of depression. And yet there are passages in the Bible that say, do not be anxious about anything, but with prayer and petition and thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. And in Peter, it says about don't be anxious. And Jesus says, don't be anxious about anything. And so there's this tension there that I guess we'll talk about in a little bit as well. Why don't we pivot? So what we're saying is depression is this deep sadness. And we're saying, hang on, as Christians, it's okay to feel depressed. It's in the Bible. Like lots of people feel that way in the Bible. So maybe let's talk about some causes, because there's some really interesting conversations I think that we can have there. Do you want to? What would you say about that? What causes depression? Do you think, Eliz?
Yeah, I think there's a wide range of things. I think there's probably kind of two camps, maybe. I don't know if that's right, but there's a sense of a biological dysfunction, you might say. So there's an imbalance of serotonin or another like hormone in your body that then means that you don't have like the happy drug. That's very scientific, isn't it? But a sense of something in your biology that and in your brain and in your functioning, that means you have you have a loss of what makes us happy in our bodies. So I think it can be a biological thing. That was really badly put.
That's okay. So that's the one thing. It's a biological function.
It can be a biological thing. Yeah, and I think it also can be kind of circumstantial or environmental. I think when I sit down with a lot of the people I work with, actually there's a sense of, okay, let's look at what is going on in your life. Like let's sit down and let's think about what's going on, because sometimes you just don't put two and two together. Like, oh, okay, your parents are going through a divorce and your dad's been quite abusive. Okay, could this contribute to how you're feeling? Actually, yes, like that is an awful situation, and it is no wonder you are feeling low and you're feeling low self-esteem and you're feeling suicidal and like you can't function because the stability of your world is kind of falling apart. And I think so I think it can be both. I think for some people it's this sense of there's a situation or something that's occurred in your life, or there's a even job loss. like you've lost your sense of purpose. I think that's going to be a huge thing for people this year, of, you've lost your routine in life, and actually that can cause this depression that can come on you because you've lost your sense of purpose. So I think it can be both. I think it can be something biological, or I think it can be something kind of more circumstantial.
Yeah, that's really good. I wholeheartedly agree based on, I've been studying for this as well. I'm certainly not an expert by any means, but I read this really helpful book called Lost Connections by a guy called Johann Hari. And again, if you're listening, I would recommend you read that book.
Yeah.
Know that the language is a little bit spicy in places, but it's such a helpful book. I want to read some of the things that he said, because I this completely changed my view of depression. He says, there is sometimes a biological component to depression, but he also found that there's this, what he describes as a troubling over-dependence on antidepressants and things like that. So what he's saying is, well, often our first reaction is to go, oh, you're feeling depressed? Well, here are some antidepressants. Not to say that antidepressants are wrong, but he says this: it's foolish to deny that there is a real biological component to depression and anxiety, and there may be other biological contributions that we haven't identified yet, but it is equally foolish to say that they are the only causes. So that's kind of fully supporting what you've said, Eliz. And he finds that there are 9 primary causes of depression and non-biological causes of depression. And he puts it down to connection, which I think is really fascinating. So he believes that the principal cause of depression is lack of connection. And so here are some that his book is called Lost Connections, so you can see where he's going there. These are the 9 that he suggests. He says disconnection from meaningful work, disconnection from other people, disconnection from meaningful values, disconnection because of childhood trauma, disconnection from status and respect, disconnection from the natural world, disconnection from a hopeful or secure future. And then he kind of pairs 8 and 9 together, which is the real role of genes and brain changes. So I guess that's the biological component he's talking about there. So think about that. Liz, I really want to kind of dig down on what you just said. You talked about this season that we're in, right? Well, so many people have lost their jobs, so they're disconnected from meaningful work. And some people, you might have a job, but you might feel like you're working a dead-end job, or that there's no purpose in what you're doing. Particularly like Generation Z, more than any other generation, feel this real desire to feel like there's meaning behind what they do. Yeah. I mean, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, your job could be totally meaningless to you, but there was a different kind of acceptance of that. Disconnection from other people. We're in COVID. We've had lockdowns galore, so there's been a disconnection from other people. From meaningful values. As our world moves towards this place where it's striving for autonomy and value, it's all about doing what's right in your own eyes. There's fewer values, and there's challenges there. There's disconnection because of childhood traumas. You talked about, maybe divorce, in your parents divorcing, or other traumas as a child. Disconnection from the natural world. So that's as simple as not going outside. That can have an effect on you.
Definitely.
Story on that quickly. When I went to Bible school in British Columbia, it's right in the mountains, and a lot of the Bible school students who came would come from the prairies where I'm actually living now. And the thing about the prairies is it's very flat. It's not the most beautiful place in the world, but it's very sunny all year round. Even when it's freezing cold, it's very sunny. And what people would find is that they would come out to British Columbia, which is a bit like the UK, where it's a bit more rainy and grey, and they would really struggle. They'd get really depressed. And so it was that seasonal affective disorder, or whatever it's called. So they'd have to take vitamin D, or vitamin D, depending where you're listening, and they would have to take it to stop themselves feeling depressed. And then disconnection from a hopeful or secure future. If you've had, maybe if you go bankrupt, or if you've had maybe you failed your degree, or maybe you've dropped out of school, or you don't know what you want to do with your life. Those things can draw you into depression, right? So there's a lot of causes. Eliz, I wonder if you would agree with those. Would you disagree with any of those? What are your thoughts on that list? What do you think?
Oh, yeah, I think that list is spot on, really. I think all of those things, I can kind of think of situations where I've seen it happen, and I've seen the consequence of disconnection from these things. I think we as a people are made to have connection, aren't we? We're made to be in community. We're made to, we're even made to work, we're made to have purpose in that. And I think, so when we lose that stuff, or when we've had some, we say childhood trauma, when we've had something like that happen to us also, it, some of the, things like childhood trauma, that can actually have an effect on your brain that changes your wiring and how you're thinking, and and how it's funcking. And that can, so you can always put that with a biological cause as well. I think, I completely agree. I think stuff like the natural world sounds so simple, doesn't it? But I think there's studies that actually say that going for a run or doing exercise is actually more effective than antidepressants, which I think is outstanding, and amazing that God's made us that way, because it releases those kind of hormones to our body that are so good for us. And like you said, that's not to say that antidepressants aren't good. I think there is, as you said, as this guy says, a heavy reliance on them, which is become quite unhealthy in our society, I think. But at the same time, I see how actually some people need antidepressants to stabilize themselves. So even if their depression is caused by something that's going on in their world, actually being able to take a drug that helps boost the functioning in their brain can allow them to get to a place where they're stable to then deal with that other stuff, if that makes sense. I do think sometimes they're handed out very quickly, when actually you need to take a look at the holistic person. I'm very much about, right, let's look at what's going on, let's deal with the root of the problem. So
yeah, great. So, I mean, we could talk about that for ages. I think it's probably good if we direct ourselves to the big questions, which is, we've talked a little bit about what depression is and what causes it. Most importantly, for the purposes of today, how do we respond? How do we respond if we're feeling depressed? If you're listening to this podcast, your question is probably, well, what do I do with that? Especially as a Christian, it's very easy to read stuff from a non-Christian perspective. But what if I'm a believer and I'm feeling that? First of all, let's talk about what we shouldn't do. Eliz, first of all, what we shouldn't do is isolate ourselves, right? That's the
opposite.
Don't isolate. Don't isolate yourselves.
Disconnecting yourself even more.
Exactly. I think the other thing as well that I feel really passionate about is don't run away from God. I think that our tendency so much that there's this irony where we think, we need God. Like, we don't mind God being around us when we don't need him, but when we need him, we run away from him. And I would say, if you're feeling depressed, that's the time to turn to God more than ever. God wants to be with you and walk with you through this. So those would be my thoughts. I mean, what would you say to that?
Oh yeah, I completely agree. And I think what we need to remember is that there's nothing too big for God that he can't handle. There's nothing that we can come before him with and he's gonna, say, oh no, not sure about that. Or he's not going to stand there and say, oh, but I've given you this. Like, why can't you be happy with your life? He's not that kind of person. And so we can come before him and be so honest. And I think that goes back to what we see in the Bible as well of, in the Psalms, the way that David laments and is like, God, where are you? I mean, even Jesus on the cross, he's like, Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? And that sense of being able to come before God and be really honest and raw and say, this is how it is right now. Because to be honest, he already knows. But it's so healthy to be able to say that out loud and say, what it's really like. So I think coming before God and being really honest is really key.
There's this book that I read that I found really helpful called, I'm always just pointing to books because I find that
you love
other people say it much better than we can. Between me and your husband, we get through a lot of books because we just love it. So there's this lady called Vanitha Risner. She was bullied as a child. She suffered multiple miscarriages, buried her own son, deals with a debilitating disease, and was left by her first husband. And she's someone, she talks about sort of the sadness that she felt. She has this book that she calls The Scars That Have Shaped Me. And she talks about how she learnt the beauty of lamenting. So A lament in the dictionary is described as this like passionate expression of grief and sorrow, which obviously connects really well with what we're talking about. And like we said, we see it all the way through the Bible. We see it in Ruth as well, and in the Psalms, which you mentioned there, Eliz. And I think I want to share some of the quotes that she says, because I think they're quite powerful, actually.
Definitely.
She says, lament can be messy, and yet I want my life to look neat. And I foolishly think that my bleached prayers somehow make God look better. Later on, she says, I don't like to lament. It seems unspiritual. Faithful Christians are even-tempered and cheerful. They rejoice in the Lord at all times without even a hint of discouragement. And then later on, she says, but then I realized that Scripture never mandates that we constantly act upbeat. God wants us to come to him in truth. People like Jeremiah and Job, Habakkuk and David have all poured out their honest feelings of sadness and disappointment to God.
Yeah.
And then finally, one more quote I want to share from her. She says, the Bible is shockingly honest. And because of that, I could be honest as well. I can both complain and cry, knowing that God can handle anything I say. The Lord wants me to talk to him, to pour out my heart and my thoughts unedited, because he knows them already. And Eliz, you talked about being honest, and that's exactly what Vinitha is saying here. You know, the first thing we can do is be honest. I think somewhere down here there's a psalm. Yeah, I've got a psalm down here where it's Psalm 130. I think it's David. It doesn't say. It says it's a song of ascents, and it says, "Out of the depths I call to you, Lord. Lord, listen to my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for help. Lord, if you kept an account of iniquities, who could stand?" And then it goes on. It goes on. But you know, that's kind of that sense. It's like you said, God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
It's okay to be honest. So that's the first thing I think we'd say. So let's pat that. Would say, yeah, it's okay to be honest. Make sure that you're honest. In fact, I would implore you to be honest.
Yeah.
Secondly, I would say it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah.
We're really bad at that in this kind of individualistic culture.
Yeah.
We want to feel like we have everything together, right? And I think it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah, it's that sense of being honest with God, but also being honest with your friends and your family and those around you, isn't it? And being vulnerable. Actually, I think we don't like to be vulnerable in society, because we say we're vulnerable, and then when it comes down to it, are we really vulnerable when the tough stuff comes up, and are we willing to talk about it? But actually being vulnerable and saying, actually, I'm struggling right now. It's not a sign of weakness, but actually I think it's a sign of strength in being able to admit that life is not the easiest that it's ever been right now.
Yeah. And in terms of asking for help, I mean, obviously you can talk to your friends, about this. You can talk to your mentors or your pastor, but sometimes you might find that your struggles, your challenges are too great for some of these people to talk about. Because let's be honest, your friends and your mentors are unqualified, and your pastor, you know, I'm someone that serves as a pastor, and you know, we aren't clinical psychiatrists or psychologists. I never know the difference between them, but we aren't that. What we are people who study the Word of God, and so there might be some like mental health challenges that you're facing that pastors won't be able to face help you with, and that's okay. Like I think we have to be okay with saying we what we can do is point you to Jesus, and that's a really, really good thing. But sometimes there are challenges that go beyond into the realms of medical care. So Eliz, I mean, what do we do at that point if we feel like, you know, we're struggling so much, and we've spoken maybe to our friends and our mentors, our pastors and all that stuff, and we feel like actually this darkness still won't lift, to use those words of John Piper.
Yeah. I think that's where we have to be so open to getting the professional help. And actually, you know, God created our, you know, psychologists to be able to kind of help us with how our brains and how we're functioning, and counselors to be able to come alongside us and just counsel us. And, you know, your GPs that you can go to if they can refer you on to other stuff. I know in the UK, that's kind of where you go to a GP, or you go and find a private counsellor. And there's so much help available out there. I would say chat to people, because I think a lot more people than you realize will know counsellors or places where they've even got help. So in my role, I see a counsellor to take all my load to, because actually holding a lot of people and working with people who are feeling down and feeling suicidal and have attempted to take their lives, actually that puts a huge can put a huge sadness on me. And you don't, you learn not to carry their burdens, but hearing that all the time is it's one of those things. And so so I see a counsellor, and we as an organisation make sure all of our team actually see a counsellor. And I think it's just so healthy. Like, I would recommend anyone to see a counsellor, really, just to have a space to talk. And whether that's for a season, whether that's to work through a certain thing, or whether that's actually you're feeling a bit burnt out and you're like, actually, I should probably go and find someone outside of my sphere of like family or work or friends, just to talk to in a confidential way, who can also give you strategies for coping and strategies to help you understand. I think these things are so much easier to work through. Well, they're not easier to work through, but it can help when you have an understanding of what's going on. And I think those professional places can help give you that understanding, which like a pastor or a friend maybe couldn't do.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really helpful to hear. There is sometimes this stigma around counsellors still, less so than ever before.
Yeah, which is great.
But you often think of just lying kind of on a horizontal bed.
Yeah, it's not like that.
An old man with a clipboard. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good thing. In my life, I've seen a counsellor. You've obviously, Eliz, you said you've seen a counsellor, and it helps. It helps you to process and to get a different perspective, or sometimes just to speak. The counsellors are funny because sometimes they just don't say anything, and you end up they just help you talk your way through stuff. And it's I think it's a good thing. So be honest. Be honest about where you're at with people. You don't have to put on this facade, and it's recognize that it's okay to ask for help. One of the things I would say as well that I really want to emphasize is that we do want to emphasize that our hope is not in this world. Our hope is in Jesus. If you're a believer, as sometimes that's really annoying to hear. You're like, well, I feel like my world is crumbling, and I don't want to worship Jesus. But the truth is, there is this reality in there that Jesus is the hope of the world. In a book called Spurgeon Sorrows by Zach Eswine. By the way, Charles Spurgeon is one of the greatest preachers ever. And he suffered terribly with depression. Yeah. But in this book that Zach Eswine writes about this, actually recommended to me by Eliz's husband, Simon, it says this: our hope, therefore, does not reside in our ability to preserve a good mood, but in his ability to bear us up. I'll say it again. Yeah. Our hope, therefore, does not reside in our ability to preserve a good mood, but in his ability to bear us up. I think that's sometimes things might feel hopeless, but the reason the Bible says to us things like, do not be anxious about anything, but with prayer and petition and thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. That's in Philippians 4:6, I think. And the reason in Peter it says, don't be anxious about anything, or cast your anxieties on the Lord, I think it says. And then why Jesus says that. The reason they say that is because our hope is not in this world. Yeah. Our hope is in the world to come, the eternity to come. So I think we have this idea that life is supposed to be happy all the time. And I think the beauty of life is that sometimes you're not happy. And it's often in those trials and those challenges that God shapes us and molds us into who he's calling us to be. I think it's 1 Peter. I think it's 1 Peter 1. I forget. But we might have talked about this in another podcast episode. If not, probably, I think we've heads up, we've pre-recorded some podcasts coming up. And I think this is one of them. But Peter talks about how we're refined by fire. And he talks about, he uses the analogy essentially of like when they refined gold in this really, really hot fire. It was super dangerous in those days. And they'd, maybe I talked about this in the suffering episode. I forget. I've talked about this recently anyway. And they refine it. And all the dross comes to the top. And what you do then with that gold is that you scrape off all the dross, all the impurities. And during that process, that hot, dangerous process, what happens is that the gold becomes more pure. And so it's in the same way, there are challenges in this life. The Bible never promises that life's going to be easy, but what we see is that God uses those challenges for our good, and sometimes in ways that are hard for us to comprehend, sometimes in ways that we don't understand. That's why we just spent 2 episodes talking about the reality and the challenge of suffering, is because sometimes it's just difficult to get our heads around this. Eliz, I wonder if you'd add anything there.
Yeah, and I think when you were talking about that, what came to mind was a similar thing in terms of sometimes when we're in that time of suffering or that time of just being so overwhelmed and we just don't want to carry on, or we're at a place where we think, why, God? Like, why is this happening? Actually, that is when we go to the deepest, most intimate place in finding that hope. And I think of a time just like last month where something happened and we were, I don't know if I've been that sad in a long time, and just this sense of sadness and this sense of just crying. You feel like you're crying for a reason, but you're crying because, and you can't stop crying. But just in that place, just finding God like deep in there and being able to just know that whatever happens, like we have such a certainty and such a hope and such a foundation that, the world will shake and the world will crumble around us, but actually we can have that hope. And I think we have to fight for that. We have to fight for joy. Sometimes we have to fight for to cling on to that hope. And that doesn't mean that suddenly in our depression, like we suddenly feel joyful and we suddenly, fight for your joy and you'll be joyful. Actually, no, like you fight for joy, and it's that sense of a difference between happy and joy, and that sense of like as you fight to believe that hope and as you fight to cling on to God as the one who is going to, give you that hope and the only one who can ever fulfill you. Like, we talk about these connections. They're all great things that obviously contribute to our well-being, but also none of those things will ever fulfill us like God does. And so as we fight for our joy in God, we find a deeper joy that goes beyond our circumstance, goes beyond how we're feeling, goes beyond any depression that can kind of come upon us. And we find a joy that we just have, it's like, you can't even describe it. It's like this, it doesn't mean you're happy all the time, but you just have a certainty in your heart that, one day everything will be restored and we will be with Jesus and, a new heavens and a new earth, and there will be no more tears and no more sorrow and no more depression. And you just have this certainty that will be there as you cling to that hope. But I do think it's something that you have to fight for sometimes.
Yeah. Amen. Very well put. I guess one last question before we finish up here, Eliz, is so that's how we respond. So if you're feeling depressed, remember that it's good to be honest. It's good to ask for help. And it's really, really, really good to put your hope in Jesus. Even if you don't see it, like you said, Eliz, there's a difference between happy and joyful. You can have hope in Jesus and still recognize, actually, I'm going through a storm right now, but I know that storm will pass.
Yeah.
That's what, if you have depression, that's how we can respond. And obviously it's tricky and it's different for everyone. Everyone has their own unique experiences. But what can we do as believers to serve those around us who are feeling depressed? Do you have any advice there, Eliz?
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to what we would say to what we said before in terms of keep connected with those people. I think when you're feeling depressed and when you're feeling out of sorts, you want to lose those connections or you don't know how to keep them. And so I think it's having real grace and having a sense of love that, you're able to look to their needs and keep those connections. And, praying for wisdom in how you can serve that person well. Pray for that person. I think, you want to stand with them. It says, we mourn with those who mourn, don't we? And I think it's the same, like it's, there's a difference between sympathy and empathy. And there's this really good video that Brené Brown does. And it talks about how sympathy is like you kind of might pass something, pop your head down the ladder and be like, it's going to be okay. Like, take this and you'll be fine. And empathy is like you get down to that person's level and you sit and you listen And I think one of the greatest gifts that we almost like resources that we have is just listen. Don't try to fix. I think that's something that I've really learned in my role is just sit and listen and affirm. Say, you know, I can see that's really hard right now. And I can see that you're really struggling. Because then the person who you're speaking to feels listened to and they feel accepted with where they are, which then allows them to start lifting out of that rather than feeling like they have to battle to be heard and the fact they're not really being heard. So a sense of, you know, a deep listening, a sense of, okay, I'm going to just sit with you where you are and listen to you. And then I think there's a sense of, okay, action plan, like what can we do to help? Sometimes that's very practical. Sometimes that's, okay, I'm going to make sure you've got up in the morning and you've had a shower. I'm going to make sure you've eaten your meals. And sometimes that's, you know, I think sometimes that's just checking in, sending a text, praying with them. But yeah, I think, you know, you want to sit and listen, and then you want to do what you can to help.
Yeah. Again, really good, Liz. I think the response is quite similar to how you deal with, that's a bad choice of words, how you respond to people who are going through grief.
Yeah.
I think not just like as Christians, one of the things we have this horrible tendency to do in the church world is to say, oh, get over it. You got Jesus. Yeah. You know, you don't need to be depressed. You've got Jesus.
Yeah.
And like, there's an element of truth to that where, yes, we have hope in Jesus. We've just talked about that. But there's also this reality that that's not helpful to say that, because that certainly doesn't feel true in the moment. Like it's how you say it that's the problem, and when you say it. It's like you say in Job, the three friends get it right for the longest time, where they just sit and listen and they're attentive, and not to say things like, I know exactly what you're going through, because you don't.
You don't.
Even if you've been through depression, like for my experience of depression is different to your experience of depression. If you're listening at home and you're feeling that, what I can say is, I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I've experienced something like this. You know, I don't understand exactly what your experience is, but I've probably experienced a little taste of it. You know, at least as a connecting point, as opposed to I know exactly what you mean. You just need to do this, which is advice that you see. That kind of stuff happens all the time.
Yeah. It's that sense of wanting to fix. And I think sometimes all you want someone to do is sit down and tell you it's pants and like acknowledge that it's pants, because you already think it's pants, and you just need someone to come and tell you that, to affirm how you're feeling. And you can feel so helpless, I think, especially if you haven't been in that place yourself. You think, like, I don't know how to deal with this, but actually just sit and listen, like, just sit and affirm how they're feeling.
Yeah, I want to be clear as well that often that comes from a good place. Like people want to help when they say
completely.
Those things.
We want to fix.
It's not that. Yeah. And you're so right. I mean, that's certainly how I'm wired as a human being. I want to fix people. I want to fix stuff, and I find it hard when I can't.
You want to help.
Yeah, so it's from a good place. I think. Yeah, I mean, another thing that I read, there's this book that we're going to talk about next week in the grief episode by a lady called Nancy Guthrie. And I think I forget the title now. It's like things you should never say to someone who's grieving, and what helps when it hurts, or something like that. It's like the longest title ever. We'll talk about it next week. But in this book, what she says is what she found wasn't helpful in her experience was when people said, can I do anything to help? As well-intentioned as that was, what she found much more helpful, and this is just a suggestion, this is not a hard and fast rule. She found that what was really helpful was when people said, hey, I'd love to bring you dinner tonight. Can I bring you dinner tonight? Or can I do your grocery shopping? Or just do her grocery shopping. Like those, the specifics were really helpful, because people who are in grief and people who are depressed often don't have the ability to be able to say, yeah, you know what I actually need right now is X, Y, and Z. But what means the world is for you to say, hey, I'm going to do something that's just going to bless you. I mean, maybe your next door neighbor, maybe you're a bit older, and your next door neighbor is just needs their lawn cut, needs you to go and cut their grass. You just go and do it for them. Yeah. Or I don't know why that's the first example that came to my mind, but I've never,
like
I've mowed a lawn like twice in my life. I don't know why I'm talking about that, but those kinds of examples where you can find ways to bless that person. Maybe give them a gift card for Nando's, or if you're in Canada, Boston Pizza or something. I don't know. Those kinds of things. Find ways to bless people. I think we could talk a lot about that, but Eliz, I think you hit the nail on the head, and I'm conscious of time. We're running out of time here. So Eliz, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. It's been
having
fun.
a conversation here on a tough, it is a tough conversation, isn't it? And it's a tough conversation. You have a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Eliz, again, thank you. Really appreciate this. If you're listening at home and you found this helpful, let us know. Maybe connect with us through social media, or you can connect with us on YouTube, on Facebook, and Instagram, and all that stuff. You can also rate this podcast and give it a like if you've found it helpful. Can you like it? I don't even know. Leave a comment is probably what I'm getting at. Next week, this is what I'm thinking about right now. This was on my mind. We are going deep into the world of grief. We're joined by one of the most incredible people in the world, one of my friends, Steve Jantz, from Miller College of the Bible. And what we'll hear next week is an incredible story of someone who sadly passed away suddenly on their campus at Christmas time. And Steve's going to share the story of what happened and how the college responded, which was just the most incredible, godly response to grief that I think I've perhaps ever seen. And the whole thing is just an amazing testimony. So I'd encourage you to stay tuned for that. Otherwise, have an amazing week, and we will speak to you very soon. Bye.